The Shetland is a small breed of sheep, mainly kept for their wool. They have a nice long staple length with no wool on the face or legs. This makes their shearing different than my Old English baby doll Southdown flock. First up is Calvin, and he is a Shetland wether. He's actually a spotted sheep, but he's basically one giant spot, so his entire fleece is white. I've actually made a hat and cowl out of his fleece, and it turned out really cool. Shetlands come in a variety of colors, which is really fun when you're knitting it into yarn. There's definitely differences in the texture of the Shetland fleeces, and there's also differences in the amount of crimp that is in the fleece. To start shearing, you can see that we first began at the top of the head and worked our way down the spine. This opens up the fleece so we can start working on the torso. Matt is shearing down the sides of the animal and stopping at an imaginary line just above the belly. The wool quality changes as we reach the belly area and the legs. So we are choosing to remove the torso, or the nice long staple length part of the fleece, first. The majority of the weight of the fleece is removed at this point. A second person can now come in and start shearing the belly and legs with a different shears. The leg wool will be discarded. Sometimes the belly wool can be used. It really just depends on the animal. You'll notice that our shearing stand is on a plywood board and a tarp to help keep the fleece clean. Once the torso is removed, go ahead and bag that up. Next, one person will hold the animal from the rear, while the second person shears the front of the neck. After the neck is completed, we will place them back into the stand where we can do some finishing touches. I'm sure Calvin feels about 10 pounds lighter already. So while Matt is finishing one of the sides, I'm grabbing a different shears and I'm shearing the butt of the animal and the tail. Most Shetlands have a pretty clean tail with mostly hair, but sometimes I will trim it a little bit with the shears. Other breeds, such as the Old English baby doll Southdowns, have a very woolly tail which needs to be sheared. The rear end of the sheep can accumulate manure, and this does need to be kept clean and short to prevent what's called fly strike. One of the things I really love about Shetlands is you can keep their tail natural, where most other breeds you have to dock their tail to keep it short and clean to prevent fly strike. I like to grab a scissors at the end and just get any finishing touches. You might be wondering why I don't shave them down shorter, but I find it's kinder to the animal to leave them some protection from sunburn and biting flies. Let's give him a once over. I think Calvin looks great, and he was such a good boy. Our next example is Hank. He is a Shetland wether, and we happen to have really good lighting this day where the sun was in our favor, so I'd like to talk more about technique for this example. We are using the Oster Showmaster with a 4-point cutter and a 20-tooth comb called the Phantom R. I do have 2 other videos talking about what's in my shearing toolbox and Sheep Shears 101 for more information. Now the Oster Showmaster does use a 4-point cutter, but you can choose which comb you would like to use. I really like the 20-tooth comb for the majority of the Shetland's body. The fleece on the torso is very nice and clean, and so I'm able to get through it with a dense comb such as the 20-tooth. It also enables me to get close to the skin without cutting the animal. Also, with this Phantom R comb, the tips of it are rounded so they are not sharp, and it's a little bit safer to use for beginners. Look how beautifully that 20-tooth comb just glides across the torso. It kind of reminds me of mowing the lawn and making lines. If you're a beginner, you do not have to go this fast. You can take your time, taking little bites at a time. You just want to be careful not to make any second cuts if you can help it. In other words, try to get it close to the skin in one swipe. As we move along farther down the side, we're going to start going in a downward motion instead of sideways. And this is where we're going to meet that imaginary line that I talked about, where the wool starts changing into the belly and the texture is going to change and be less quality. Now that the bulk is removed, go ahead and bag it up. He has a really large fleece, as he is quite large for a Shetland. They look pretty funny at this stage. Now what's atypical here is that Matt is actually able to continue on with the belly with the 20-tooth comb. And this is pretty atypical. This means his fleece was pretty clean and nice, and most likely I was able to save it for processing. You can see that I'm actually going through that wool to see if I want to keep it or not. So again, we're about to unhook him from the stand to shear the front of his neck. I'm holding the rear end of the animal to hold him still, while Matt is shearing the front of the neck. Occasionally, he'll hit the top of the head with the shears, but typically I will use a hand scissors to do that part. Once again, I like to look him over, and surprisingly, there really is no touch-up needed. He turned out really well. Next up is Genesis, and he is another wether. He looks just like his sire, Rollo. When he was a lamb, he used to follow me around the yard, and he'd want to take a nap on my lap. It was so cute. So again, we started at the top of the head and made that line down the spine, opened up the torso, and now we're going downwards on the side of the torso. We are using the 20-tooth comb, as I recommended. Now, the cutter I use is a 4-point cutter, and it's called the Spitfire, and I purchased it from Premier One Supplies. It seems that nowadays all of the shears use 4-point cutters, and for that reason they are easier to buy and purchase online. The texture of the wool on that back leg thigh area is a little bit different. I would say it's more hair-like, and it can be very long and sometimes get matted up. The wool in that area is also very thick, and if your sheep have lice, that is a really good area to find them. I'll make a video on lice in the future. Although a lot of shearing is tactile, I will say that when it comes to the visual aspect of it, it is easier with a light colored fleece against a pink skin, versus a black fleece against black skin is more difficult to visualize. One of the things that I enjoy about Shetlands is their diversity of colors, and not only that, but they seem to change color as they go from lamb to mature adult. For example, I had one lamb that was born black. She later changed to what I would call M-skit, kind of a bluish silvery color. And now I swear she's changing color and lightening up even more. It's very interesting. With Genesis here, his marking is what is called Catmaggot, where he's lighter on the top and he has like a dark stripe going underneath his belly. And that pattern is coming from his sire. So for Genesis, he doesn't really need that much touch-up. Again, he cleaned up pretty nicely. I do feel that the males sometimes shear nicer than the females. So I'm going to grab his rear end to hold him still, once again while Matt shears the front of the neck. He has very minimal touch-ups that I'll do with the scissors here at the very end. Once we finish the shearing, we like to transfer them to the deck chair to do their hoof trimming. I do have videos on the deck chair and hoof trimming as well. He looks great. Next up is Olympia. She is one of my favorites. She is definitely a special girl for many reasons. One of which is her color. If you notice, she is all the way black through and through with no brown tipping on the fleece. So this is kind of rare and it's really cool. Also, her fleece is different than my other Shetlands where it's very hair-like. It's kind of hard to explain it, but it's got a nice long staple length and more like hair strands. I really enjoy spinning her fleece, and actually I have her wool on my spinning wheel right now. She's also an extra small Shetland, which is one of the reasons that I selected her when I was buying my breeding ewes. She gets these tufts of hair on the top of her head, which is what I'm actually trimming with the scissors here. For being my tiniest sheep, Olympia does provide us with an amazingly large amount of fleece nonetheless. And I will add that her personality does not match her size. Here's an up-close look at her fleece. She's a beaut, Clark. Because her fleece is so nice, we're both going to carry on using the 20-tooth comb to finish her up. There was one summer that Olympia managed to get into a patch of weeds and get covered head to toe in cockleburs. She was calm enough to just let me sit there and pick the cockleburs out one by one, which is really interesting with this breed because I find that a lot of them like getting picked clean. Even my ram likes getting his fleece picked clean. He starts getting sleepy-eyed and closing his eyes while I do it, so it must be pretty relaxing. I'm applying oil to the shears before I start trimming on the rear end. This is number 10 white clipping oil, and this needs to be applied every few minutes throughout your shearing. Without the lubrication, the shears can overheat and dull rather quickly. You may notice that the shears is not cutting very well, and sometimes you can hear a difference in the sound that the machine is making. Now keep in mind that the shears is actually very loud in real life. I have just silenced the audio to make this video a little bit more pleasant. So pay attention to the sound that your shears is making. When you add the lubricant while it is running, the sound will change within a second. It's hard to describe, but you'll know it when you try it yourself. Now I'm just grabbing a scissors and trimming any tufts of hair that are remaining around her halter. Doesn't she look so sleek? Such a beautiful black color. I love it. Next up is Amaze, and she is an older Shetland ewe. I originally purchased her for her color. Now her fleece is kind of a light brown, but on her skin she has swirls of brown, which is kind of neat. When I process her fleece at the carding stage, the blending of the colors really changes the finished product. It's pretty cool. So again, we're using the 20-tooth Phantom R comb on the Oster Showmaster. Now I do want to talk about my second shearing machine, which I haven't shown a lot in the videos thus far. The Shetland fleeces are so nice that you can get away with using that 20-tooth comb for most of the time. The times when I would use my other shearing machine is for the butt, the belly, and the legs. Now other breeds such as baby dolls, I absolutely have to have both shears. You would never be able to get the shearing done with the 20-tooth comb on those breeds. So the second shear that I have is a Sunbeam 3-point cutter with a 10-tooth comb. Now the 3-point cutters are pretty obsolete, and this is a very old shears that I bought at an auction. Fortunately, Oster does still sell the 3-point cutters, but any newer shearing machine would have a 4-point cutter. So the comb that I'm using is a 10-tooth comb. Now obviously this has less teeth and it's going to have wider spacing in it, so it's much easier to cut the animal. On the other hand, it will cut more easily through tough wool. What do I mean by that? I mean wool that has tags. Sheep will have these black tags, often on the belly and legs. It can be matted up and very gummy, to say the least. Also, the belly wool can be just more dense in general. And these areas of the body are typically more dirty, so you're going to plug up the comb much quicker. So basically, I'm going to use that 10-tooth comb in areas where second cuts are okay. If you're sticking with the Oster, you would use a 13-tooth comb. My next example is Echo, and she is a Shetland ewe. Now on her, I will be using the Sunbeam with the 10-tooth comb. Sometimes her fleece is difficult to cut, which brings me to some troubleshooting tips for you. If you find that you're not cutting well, and you've tried lubricating every few minutes, another thing to consider is adjusting the tension. I do talk about the tension more in my Sheep Shears 101 video. Most likely, if it's not cutting the fleece well, you will need to tighten the tension by turning it clockwise. On the one hand, you want the tension to be tight enough to do its job, but you don't want it so tight that it overheats and dulls your equipment. If you have the tension too loose, the machine may fall apart when you turn it on, which is quite dangerous. So it really is all about finding that sweet spot for the tension. A general rule of thumb is to tighten the tension finger tight and then go just half a turn slightly tighter. I like to do this as my starting point, and then I can adjust the tension based on the animal. And I will say that every animal is different. And as you can see, I am doing the belly right now with the Sunbeam. because I remember Echo that her fleece is more difficult from years past. Be prepared to lubricate frequently. You may need to stop and clean your shears halfway through doing the animal. Now I can guarantee that Matt is over there cleaning the 20-tooth comb right now as I'm carrying on with the 10-tooth. And now that he has cleaned it, he has come back to do some finishing work. If the comb is plugged up with lanolin, it will not comb through the fleece, and you will be very frustrated. I have a video on how we clean our shears without using water. Some breeds have more lanolin and will plug it up much quicker, so you may need to stop 1 to 2 times during the shearing process, which is why it's really nice to have a second person so they can keep going while the other one stops to clean. I would say that the Shetlands are easiest in this regard. So again, I highly recommend the 20-tooth comb for the torso and the 10 or 13-tooth comb for the belly, butt, and legs. There are other options for cutters and combs on the market, and you can try and experiment what works for you. This is just simply what works for me. I do feel that these selections are pretty beginner friendly and great for the small farmer. You will need to regularly purchase new combs and cutters or have them sharpened. My last example is Rollo, a Shetland ram. So you're probably wondering why he's missing about 1/3 of his fleece on the front of his body, and the reason is he was ruing. Now I have a video explaining what ruing is. Essentially, this breed can actually start shedding the fleece on their own when springtime arrives. Because winter decided to continue on through the month of April, it got a little late this year. Which brings me to the topic of when you want to shear. Now I live in Minnesota in the USA, and we typically would shear from April 15 to May 15. You want the weather to be dry with no humidity. When the wool is wet and damp, it will be next to impossible to cut and you will be very frustrated. A pretty safe range for temperature is about 50 to maybe 65 degrees Fahrenheit. From my experience, if it's too cold, the sheep will be cold and literally shiver even if inside a barn. That is why I prefer to be above 50 degrees for shearing. On the other hand, once you start getting close to 70 degrees, it actually is too warm for shearing, as I feel that the sheep kind of get sweaty and damp, and again, the wool will be difficult to cut. So it's a very fine line between too cold and too hot. You also want to make sure that you have good lighting. Now thankfully in the spring, the days are longer and you can have the sun in your favor. But some of those cloudy, rainy days, you may need to set up lights inside your barn to get the job done. Rollo has such a clean fleece that I am using the 20-tooth comb for his entire shearing job today. Now I may be stating the obvious, but obviously when you're shearing under the belly, you need to be aware of the genitalia, as well as the scrotum or the udder for a female. Not so much of an issue for the Shetlands, but it is more of an issue with the baby doll sheep as they are very woolly. If you've watched other videos on YouTube about shearing, you will notice that most people do not use a shearing stand. Rather, they will place the animal on their rear end on a piece of plywood on the ground. This technique is the traditional way, and this is what you would learn if you went to shearing school. There is definitely more than one way to shear a sheep. Experiment and see what works best for you. In my opinion, as long as you get from point A to point B, then it is a job well done. There are some reasons why I recommend using a shearing stand. First, I find it more ergonomic. There's less bending over and it's easier on my back. I don't really want to wrestle a sheep around that weighs more than I do. Plus, I've been injured before and I don't want to repeat any injuries. I can take my time and I don't feel rushed. I don't have to place pregnant ewes in awkward positions. Lastly, it's less stress for the animal and less stress for me. As I'm picking chaff and stems out of Rollo's fleece, I end up slicing my finger open. Oops. It's amazing how sharp those stems are as I go back in disbelief. Dang. So now that we have all of these beautiful fleeces that we've sheared, what can we do with them? Well, I have an entire playlist devoted to wool processing, so be sure to check out my channel to learn more about sheep and wool. Once you've processed the wool, some examples for use include making carded bats to put inside of a quilt, spinning the wool into yarn in which you could knit hats, weaving the yarn on a loom, or even stuffing it into a pillow for pillow stuffing. I hope you've learned some tips to try today, and I hope that you found the before and after rather enjoyable. If you'd like to learn about shearing other breeds for both education and entertainment, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.